Imagine being, I don't know, 19 years old. You are trapped in this unpressurized aluminum tube, and it is freezing. We're talking like 60 degrees below zero, 5 miles above the Earth.
Right, just completely hostile to human life.
Exactly. And the air around you is literally turning black with exploding shrapnel. And if you take your gloves off to fix a jammed machine gun, your bare fingers will actually freeze to the metal in a matter of seconds.
Just instantly.
Yeah, instantly. Your oxygen mask is literally the only thing keeping you conscious. You're terrified, you are exhausted, and you have to wake up and do this all again tomorrow.
Assuming you survive today.
Assuming you survive. So today we are doing a dedicated book review. We are going to just totally immerse ourselves in this monumental work of history that drops us right into that freezing cockpit. We are diving into Donald L. Miller's Masters of the Air, America's bomber boys who fought the air war against Nazi Germany.
And it is such a fitting subject for a deep dive because, this isn't just some dry recounting of troop movements or strategic map lines on a battlefield. This is a really profound searching history of human endurance. It takes us from these sterile chalkboards where military theories are first born straight into the brutal, chaotic reality of what actually happens when human beings are asked to execute those theories in the sky.
And before we get into the battles and, the unimaginable conditions these young men face, we really need to introduce the architect of this narrative. Because if you are going to spend your time diving into a history of this magnitude, you really want to know you are in capable hands.
Oh, absolutely.
Donald L. Miller is the John Henry McCracken Professor of History at Lafayette College, and his credentials are just rock solid. He's written these massive, sweeping epics like The Story of World War II, D-Days in the Pacific, and City of the Century.
Yeah, he really knows how to marshal just an overwhelming amount of historical data and turn it into a compelling narrative.
He does, but what makes this specific book so powerful, I think, is how deeply he grounds that massive scale in the personal, fragile realities of human life. And you see it right away, like before you even reach the first chapter.
You're talking about the dedication.
Yes. The dedication. You open the book, and the very first thing you see is this dedication to his father and to his 6 grandchildren. He actually lists them out. Alyssa, Alexis, Ashley, Devin, Austin, and Mason.
Right.
And he calls them the gang at the Black Cat Bar, which is apparently this gathering place in his home that was named by his granddaughter.
It's this incredibly warm, familial image.
It is, and it creates this stark, almost chilling juxtaposition with the sheer brutality of the history he's about to unpack,
It really frames the entire reading experience because it reminds you that history isn't just about dates and machinery. It's about generations. It's about the very real teenagers who fought these wars and the generations of grandchildren who end up inheriting the world shaped by that violence.
And the critical acclaim for this book is just staggering. I mean, David McCullough, who is arguably one of our greatest popular historians, he called it a stunning achievement.
High praise from McCullough.
Very high praise. He pointed out that the compound effect of the narrative vitality is terrifying, extraordinary, and highly admirable. And for anyone keeping an eye on television, you probably know this book was adapted into a major Apple TV Plus series, so the narrative power is just undeniable.
Yeah, and James Bradley, he wrote Flags of Our Fathers. He praised Miller for recovering the essential, painful details of the war. He specifically uses this phrase, psychiatric ruin, to describe what happened to these bomber crews.
Psychiatric ruin. That is heavy.
It is. Bradley points out that this account is especially valuable because it strips away all those sanitized fantasies of the good war that many of us have been handed over the decades. It demands that we look at the unvarnished reality.
And that is exactly our mission today. If you're listening right now and expecting an hour of us just rattling off airplanes specifications, engine horsepower, wingspans, payload capacities, we are going way beyond that.
Yeah, this isn't an engineering annual.
Right. We are going to explore the radical renegade minds who invented a brand new kind of warfare from scratch. We are going to look at that exact psychiatric ruin, and we are going to tell the terrifying stories of the men who had to fight an enemy on a battlefield moving at 3 miles per minute, 5 miles above the Earth's crust.
Which is just wild to think about. But to understand how a 19-year-old farm kid ends up shivering in an aluminum tube over Germany, you really have to rewind. You have to understand the genesis of the idea itself.
Where did it start?
Well, long before there were B-17 flying fortresses, there was just a radical theory pushed by a man who was totally determined to upend the entire military establishment. We have to look at William Mitchell. Billy Mitchell, the founding father of American air power.
Mitchell is one of those characters who practically leaps off the page. I mean, he was practically destined for the spotlight. He was the son of a United States senator from Wisconsin, and his grandfather was this Gilded Age railroad king. He was wealthy, handsome, flamboyant.
He spoke flawless French.
Right.
He was a championship polo player who walked around military bases wearing these expensively tailored uniforms and high cavalry boots. He just had this innate, almost overwhelming sense of drama and presence. But he was also a man of action. He actually quit college at 18 just so he could go fight in the Spanish-American War.
And when World War I broke out, he was the first American airman to arrive at the Western Front and the first to fly over enemy lines. But it wasn't the thrill of flying that radicalized Billy Mitchell, was it? It was what he looked down and saw on the ground.
Exactly. World War I was entirely defined by the unprecedented horrors of trench warfare. The technology of killing had just drastically outpaced the tactics of movement. Think about what had just been introduced to the battlefield: the mechanized machine gun, poison gas, highly accurate rifled artillery.
Right, these advances made traditional infantry attacks, like just running across an open field toward an enemy, completely suicidal.
It resulted in static, close-quarter slaughter. You had these long, brutal wars of attrition where millions of men died in the mud just to move a front line a few miles, only to lose that same ground the next week. The hegemony of the defense was absolute. The defense was simply too strong to overcome with traditional ground forces.
So Mitchell looks down at this static slaughter and essentially realizes the entire paradigm of human conflict is broken.
Yes.
He, along with a few European counterparts, started desperately seeking a way to bypass the trenches entirely.
He was heavily influenced by Air Marshal Hugh Trenchard, who was the founding father of Britain's Royal Air Force. Trenchard had become a deep believer in bomber warfare after the Germans shocked the world by bombing London with Zeppelins and twin-engine Gotha bombers.
Which was unprecedented.
Totally unprecedented. They killed almost 1,400 civilians. It was this terrifying new reality that the enemy could just fly right over your army and strike your capital. Trenchard retaliated by sending his own 4-engine Handley Page bombers to attack German cities in the Rhineland.
Mitchell saw this and became utterly convinced that America needed an autonomous air force, completely independent from the Army and the Navy. He also absorbed the theories of this Italian air commander named General Giulio Douhet. Douhet published this masterwork called The Command of the Air.
And even though Mitchell never read Douhet's book directly, he corresponded with aircraft designers who shared Douhet's ideas. Both men arrived at the exact same radical conclusion. The airplane was the ultimate offensive weapon.
They called this concept winged victory, right?
Yes, winged victory. The core assumption was that to shorten a war, to prevent another generation from dying in muddy trenches, you had to return the advantage to the offensive. If the machine gun gave the advantage to the defense on the ground, the airplane would swing it back to the offense in the sky.
So while German strategists were secretly developing fast-striking tanks to break the lines on the ground, Mitchell and Douhet were drawing up plans for blitzkrieg from the heavens.
Basically, yeah. His vision was total war. Even right after the armistice in 1918, Mitchell was already laying plans for strategic assaults on the German homeland, using incendiary bombs and poison gas. He didn't just want to hit the enemy army, he wanted to destroy crops, forests, livestock.
Wow.
He believed that if you attack a nation's homeland and destroy its morale, the war ends quickly. He explicitly wrote, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but essentially, I was sure that if the war lasted, air power would decide it.
So Mitchell was proposing a fundamental paradigm shift. I mean, for centuries, warfare followed a basic rule. Armies fought armies. Civilians, agriculture, and industry were safely behind the lines. Mitchell was saying those lines no longer exist. The sky is a limitless three-dimensional highway leading directly to the heart of the enemy's nation. There is no front line anymore.
Exactly. The front line is everywhere.
You know, reading about Mitchell, I can't help but see a parallel to a modern Silicon Valley tech founder.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Right. He's that visionary who sees a disruptive, revolutionary future that the established old guard industry completely dismisses. He's like Steve Jobs looking at a graphical user interface while everyone else is insisting command lines are totally fine. The Army and the Navy were the old guard. They were heavily invested in battleships and infantry tactics. And here comes Mitchell telling them their multi-million-dollar battleships are completely obsolete sitting ducks.
It's a very apt comparison. And just like many of those disruptive founders, Mitchell was relentless, uncompromising, and highly theatrical. He realized that writing white papers wasn't going to change the minds of entrenched generals and admirals. He needed massive public stunts.
Which leads us to July 1921. Mitchell is trying to prove to the Navy that an airplane can sink a battleship. The Navy thought this was just archaic nonsense. So Mitchell leverages his political connections to force the Navy into a public demonstration.
Right, they had to prove it. The target was a captured German battleship, the Ostfriesland, anchored off the coast of Virginia. The Navy considered this ship practically unsinkable.
Of course they did.
Mitchell brought in his small ragtag air fleet. They flew out over the ocean, located the massive ship, and dropped 6 2,000-pound bombs.
And we have to explain the mechanics of this because they didn't just drop the bombs directly on the deck, right?
Exactly. Mitchell understood the physics of water displacement. If you drop a bomb on the armored deck of a battleship, it causes topside damage, but it might not sink it. Mitchell instructed his pilots to drop the bombs in the water right next to the hull.
Oh, that is brilliant.
Right, because when a 2,000-pound bomb detonates underwater, water doesn't compress. The explosive shock wave travels directly into the unarmored lower hull of the ship, literally crushing its ribs and breaking its back from below. In a matter of minutes, that massive, supposedly unsinkable dreadnought rolled over and went straight to the bottom of the ocean.
I can just imagine the Navy brass standing on their observation ships, watching their entire strategic doctrine sink beneath the waves. And of course, they immediately made excuses. They claimed the test was unfair because the ship was stationary, its guns were muffled, it was a sitting duck. They completely refused to accept the changing reality.
They were in total denial.
Complete denial. And because Mitchell was constantly fighting with General John Pershing, who vehemently opposed an independent air force, he got absolutely nowhere with the Army either.
But Mitchell couldn't be quieted. The military establishment tried to sideline him. The Army refused to reappoint him as Assistant Chief of the Air Service and exiled him to a minor base in San Antonio, Texas in 1925.
Just sent him packing.
One historian actually compared it to Napoleon's exile to Elba. They even gave him this humiliating office where one wall was literally an open latrine for clerks. They really wanted to break his spirit.
But out in the sagebrush, he just kept plotting. And then the breaking point arrives. 2 terrible military air accidents happen, a Navy dirigible crashes, and a seaplane goes down. Fatalities. Mitchell sees his opening and publicly accuses the Navy and War Departments of incompetence and criminal negligence.
And you cannot direct the words criminal negligence at your military superiors without guaranteeing a swift, brutal reaction. Mitchell knew this. He intentionally provoked a spectacular 7-week-long court-martial.
Hap Arnold, one of Mitchell's closest supporters, was doing public relations for the Air Service at the time. He said of Mitchell, he wouldn't rest until he became a martyr.
And he got exactly what he wanted. He was convicted of making insubordinate public statements and suspended from duty for 5 years. But for Mitchell, the revolution was always more important than his own rank. He resigned his commission entirely so he could continue his public fight for an independent Air Force as a civilian.
His stridency did rub some people the wrong way, even within his own ranks. Jimmy Doolittle, a rising star in aviation, later wrote that Mitchell, quote, like all zealots, was intolerant of any view other than his own. But the personality flaws didn't matter anymore. The seed was planted. Mitchell was exiled from the official corridors of power, but his ideas had infected a tight-knit group of younger disciples.
This is the crucial turning point. How do you keep a rogue, disruptive idea alive when the charismatic leader is gone?
Right, how do you do it?
You form a dedicated core group. You form an insurgency within the ranks. Inside the War Department, Mitchell had to depend on these loyalists to continue the battle of ideas. They became known as the Bomber Mafia.
Let's talk about the key players in this mafia, because these are the men who would eventually direct the air war over Europe. We've got Hap Arnold, Carl Toohey Spatz, Ira Eaker, and Jimmy Doolittle. They were bound together by an absolute devotion to Billy Mitchell and a pure, unadulterated love of aviation.
They were incredibly brave, both in the air and politically. During Mitchell's sensational court-martial, Spatz and Arnold actually put their own military careers on the line by testifying on his behalf against the top brass.
That takes guts.
It does. Ira Eaker, who had legal training, actually helped shape Mitchell's defense. They just revered the man.
So with Mitchell gone, they take up the mantle. But they realize arguing with generals in boardrooms just isn't working. They have to prove the viability of these machines in the sky. So throughout the 1920s and 30s, they orchestrated a series of highly publicized, record-setting stunts.
And I want to emphasize to you listening, this was not just daredevil hot-dogging for the newspapers. This was absolutely essential, rigorous research and development for a global war they all knew was coming.
Let's break down some of these exploits because the technical achievements are astounding. In 1929, Carl Spaatz and Ira Eaker were part of the crew of a trimotor plane, appropriately named the Question Mark. They set a world endurance record by staying airborne for over 150 hours.
That is over 6 continuous days in the air in 1929.
Wait, how is that physically possible when airplanes barely had the fuel capacity to fly for half a day?
They did it by utilizing the revolutionary and highly dangerous technique of mid-air refueling. But you have to picture what mid-air refueling looked like back then. It wasn't the computerized telescoping booms we have today.
What was it?
They had another plane fly slightly above the question mark. A crew member in the upper plane would physically lower a heavy, swaying rubber hose down through the open air. A crew member in the question mark had to lean out, grab this flailing hose in the freezing wind, shove it into their gas tank, and hold it there while aviation fuel poured down.
That sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
They did this over and over, day and night, occasionally getting drenched in toxic freezing fuel.
It sounds like sheer madness. But they were proving a massive strategic point, right? An airplane isn't limited by its internal gas tank. It could theoretically stay aloft indefinitely, meaning its range to strike an enemy was practically limitless.
Exactly. Then you have Jimmy Doolittle. He actually took a leave from his military duties to attend MIT, where he earned one of the very first American doctorates in aeronautical engineering. He was literally a scientist of the sky. And in 1929, he achieved a monumental milestone. He became the first pilot in the world to execute a blind landing. I need to pause here because the psychological barrier of this is insane. We're talking about flying with a physical hood covering the entire cockpit. It is pitch black. He cannot see the ground, the sky, the horizon, nothing.
To understand the terror of this, you have to understand spatial disorientation. When humans can't see the horizon, our inner ear plays tricks on us. You can feel like you are flying perfectly straight, but you are actually banking into a deadly spiral. Without a horizon, a pilot will almost always crash.
So how did he do it?
Doolittle had to completely suppress his own biological instincts and put blind, absolute trust in a set of newly developed, primitive gyroscopic instruments on his dashboard. He took off, flew a precise course, and landed safely, relying solely on those dials. And then Ira Eaker takes that concept and scales it up to a staggering degree. Flying with a hood over his cockpit, Eaker becomes the first pilot to make an entire transcontinental flight across the United States using only instruments.
Hap Arnold wasn't about to be left out either. In 1934, he led a flight of 10 two-engine bombers on a nonstop journey from Washington State all the way to Alaska and back. They were flying over trackless, subarctic mountains, massive glaciers, places where a crash meant certain death and where navigational landmarks simply did not exist.
Okay, let's connect the dots here. I'm putting myself in the shoes of someone learning this for the first time. I see the bomber mafia flying a trimotor around for a week, Doolittle flying blindfolded, Arnold flying over glaciers. It feels a bit like a flying circus. What is the actual tactical link here? How does lowering a garden hose from a biplane translate into dropping bombs on a Nazi ball-bearing factory 15 years later?
It is the absolute foundation of everything that followed. These stunts were actively solving the exact geographical and meteorological problems they would face in the European theater. To bomb deep into Germany from bases in England, you need massive range and endurance.
Right.
The question mark flight proved that both the machines and the human bodies could withstand the punishing multi-hour flights required to cross hostile territory and make it back.
Ah, okay. The human endurance factor. You have to know, the pilots won't just collapse from exhaustion.
Exactly. And the weather factor is even more critical. Northern Europe has one of the most capricious, terrible weather systems in the world. England is notoriously foggy. Germany is often covered in thick cloud banks. Yeah. If you can only fly when the sky is clear and blue, your Air Force is entirely useless for half the year in Europe.
So the blind flying was key.
Doolittle and Eaker's blind flights proved that weather didn't have to ground an air armada. They could navigate through zero visibility, pierce through the cloud layers, and find their targets. The Alaskan flight proved they could navigate over vast, featureless, hostile terrain. They were building the exact toolkit required for the 8th Air Force to function.
That makes perfect sense. They were proving the machines and the men could physically reach the target. But having the reach is only half the equation. You need to know what you are actually going to do when you get there. They needed to refine the strategy. They had to transition from Billy Mitchell's blunt theory of just dropping incendiaries on crops and terrorizing civilians, into a uniquely American tactic.
Which brings us to the intellectual incubator of this entire war, the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama. We move from the rogue pilots pushing the physical limits in the sky to the academic chalkboards, where the blueprint for the destruction of Nazi Germany was drawn.
Maxwell Field was the first professional school for aviators and aviation planners in the world. Billy Mitchell died in 1936, but his ghost haunted the halls of this school. The faculty was led by a man named Lieutenant Colonel Harold L. George, who was their leading bomber theorist.
Colonel George gave his students a mission statement that really defined a generation. He told them, "We are not concerned with fighting the past war. We are concerned in determining how air power will be employed in the next war." They were actively fighting against the institutional trap of preparing for the last conflict.
Officially, to appease the War Department, these instructors still had to pretend the bomber was a defensive weapon used to protect the American coastline from enemy ships. But behind closed doors in the classrooms, the ideas of the ultimate offense reigned supreme.
But it was a refined defense. The text refers to it as Mitchellism with a difference. Mitchell and Dewey had believed the primary goal of bombing was to shatter civilian morale. You bomb the cities, the people panic, they overthrow their government, and the war ends.
But the theorists at Maxwell Field looked at that and fundamentally disagreed. They asked a much more analytical, almost surgical question. They asked, what are the critical strong points in a modern industrial nation's infrastructure, and exactly how can they be taken out?
They began to view a modern industrial economy as a highly interconnected, fragile web. You don't need to destroy an entire city to stop a war machine. You just need to sever the vital arteries.
Like choke points.
Exactly. If you destroy the ball-bearing factories, the enemy cannot build engines or tanks. If you destroy the oil refineries, their planes cannot fly and their supply trucks stop rolling. You find the choke points.
And this intellectual pivot at Maxwell Field led directly to the birth of a strategy that was entirely unique to the Americans' daylight precision bombing.
This was a massive divergence from how the British fought the air war. The Royal Air Force, after taking devastating losses early in the war, shifted almost entirely to flying at night. They practiced area bombing or city busting.
Just dropping bombs blindly.
Right, they would drop massive amounts of bombs over general areas in the dark. The Americans believed that with their heavily armed, multi-engine bombers and highly advanced technology, they could fly during the day, visually identify a specific factory, and destroy it without necessarily leveling the surrounding civilian neighborhoods.
Let's talk about that technology, because daylight precision bombing relies entirely on a piece of machinery that was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, the Norden bomb sight. This wasn't just a crosshair on a piece of glass.
Not at all. The Norden bomb sight was an early, incredibly complex analog computer. It was made of gyroscopes, gears, and mirrors. It was considered so vital and so secret that bombardiers had to take an oath to defend it with their lives.
I read that it was actually rigged with an explosive charge.
Yes, an incendiary explosive charge. If the plane was going down, the bombardier had to trigger the thermite to melt the sight into a puddle of slag so the Germans couldn't reverse engineer it.
The mechanics of how it worked are just fascinating. When the bomber approached the target, the bombardier would look through the sight and input a series of variables: the altitude, the airspeed, the wind drift, the ballistics of the specific bomb. The analog computer would calculate the exact parabolic trajectory the bomb would take.
And here is the craziest part of the Norden system. During the actual bomb run, the final minutes approaching the target, the bombardier literally took over flying the airplane.
Wait, really? The pilot wasn't flying?
The pilot let go of the controls. The bomb sight was connected to the plane's autopilot. Once the crosshairs were locked onto the factory, the bombardier engaged the system, and the airplane was flown by the mechanical inputs of the bomb sight to ensure absolute stability until the bombs were released.
I really want you to think about the massive, terrifying risk embedded in this strategy. It looks brilliant and clinical on a chalkboard in sunny Alabama, but what does daylight precision actually mean in the sky over Europe?
It means you can clearly see your specific industrial target. But it also means that the enemy fighter planes and the anti-aircraft flak batteries on the ground can see you perfectly.
The Americans were relying entirely on the assumption that a massive formation of heavy bombers, dozens of B-17s flying in these tight, overlapping boxes, could defend itself with its own .50 caliber machine guns. They believed these were literal flying fortresses that didn't need fighter plane escorts.
And they had to believe that because at the start of the war, There was no Allied fighter plane that had the fuel range to accompany the bombers all the way deep into Germany and back.
But when these young men who were referred to early on as Eaker's amateurs actually took to the skies to execute the sterile theory, the reality they faced shattered all those assumptions. It was an absolute nightmare.
We have to step into that nightmare now. The book focuses heavily on the 8th Air Force's campaign. To truly understand what Miller is writing about, we have to look at the environment of this specific battlefield. One of the reviewers, Richard B. Frank, described it in a way that just chills you. He called it an epic saga of a struggle against fighters, flak, and weather on a battlefield moving at 3 miles per minute, 5 miles above the Earth's crust.
5 miles up. That is an altitude that is completely hostile to human biology. The bombers were not pressurized like modern passenger jets. They were just thin metal shells. The temperatures at 25,000 feet routinely dropped to 60 degrees below zero. It was so cold that ambient moisture from a crew member's breath would instantly freeze into sheets of ice on the inside of the fuselage.
You had waist gunners standing in open windows, firing heavy machine guns into the freezing slipstream. If a gun jammed and a gunner took off his thick fleece-lined glove for even a few seconds to clear the action, the sweat on his fingers would freeze instantly to the frigid metal of the gun. Men lost fingers to frostbite routinely.
And then there is the hypoxia oxygen deprivation.
Oh yeah. Above 10,000 feet, the human brain cannot get enough oxygen to function. Every crew member was tethered to an oxygen system. But in combat, lines get severed by shrapnel, masks freeze over. If your oxygen supply gets cut off at 25,000 feet, you don't gasp for air, you simply become euphoric, confused, and then you lose consciousness in about 3 minutes.
Wow, 3 minutes.
3 minutes. If no one plugs you into a backup bottle, you die silently in your seat before the enemy even fires a shot at you.
That is the baseline environment. Now add the enemy. The entire daylight bombing strategy required the planes to fly in tight formations to overlap their machine gun fire for defense. But flying in a tight formation means you have to fly straight and level. You cannot take evasive maneuvers.
Which made them perfect targets for the German anti-aircraft guns, known as flak. Let's explain the mechanics of flak, because it wasn't like dodging bullets. Flak guns fired massive 88mm explosive shells into the sky.
And they didn't even have to hit the plane, did they?
No. The shells were set with altitude fuses. They didn't have to hit the bomber directly. The shell would reach 25,000 feet and detonate, instantly expanding into a terrifying cloud of jagged, red-hot steel shrapnel.
The sky would literally turn black with these explosions. The bomber crews had to fly their unarmored, fuel-laden planes directly through these fields of exploding steel. The shrapnel would tear through the thin aluminum skin of a B-17-like paper. It would sever hydraulic lines, shatter engines, and tear through human bodies.
And the crews just had to sit there and take it. It couldn't swerve. The bombardier had control of the autopilot through the Norden sight, and they had to fly in a perfectly straight line through hell to drop their payload accurately.
And if they survived the flak fields over the target, they had to face the Luftwaffe. The German fighter pilots were defending their homeland. Miller captures the sheer intimacy of this combat perfectly. He calls it mano a mano. These young American boys in the bombers weren't firing at abstract coordinates. They were looking out their plexiglass windows and seeing the faces of the German fighter pilots flashing past at 300 miles an hour, guns blazing.
The psychological toll of this is exactly what James Bradley meant by psychiatric ruin.
Yeah.
Imagine the sheer dissonance of their existence. You wake up on a base in the idyllic English countryside. You have bacon and eggs for breakfast.
Very civilized.
Right. And 2 hours later, you are fighting a desperate, bloody, freezing battle for your life 5 miles in the air, watching your friends in the planes next to you get blown out of the sky.
Yeah.
And if you survive, you're back in England a few hours later, drinking a beer in a quiet pub, knowing you have to do it all again tomorrow.
The odds of survival in the early years were mathematically abysmal. The crews were required to fly 25 combat missions before they could go home. But the statistical loss rate meant that mathematically it was almost impossible to complete a 25-mission tour without being shot down or killed. They were essentially asked to execute a suicide strategy.
Long before the D-Day invasion at Normandy, long before the ground troops hit the beaches, the only American casualties on European soil were these flyboys falling from the sky. They were waging the Allies' longest campaign of the war, bringing the fight directly to Hitler's doorstep.
Miller is incredibly judicious as a historian here. He doesn't shy away from the horrific cost on the ground either. He unflinchingly describes the devastation wrought by this bombing campaign on German civilians. He balances the heroism of the American bomber crews with the moral and human catastrophe occurring beneath their bombs.
It is a tragic calculus of total war, and Miller handles it without taking political sides or moralizing. He just presents the brutal historical truth. We just want to make sure we are conveying what the text says without endorsing any particular side.
Absolutely. The human stories he uses to illuminate this big picture calculus are devastating. He spends a lot of time on the 100th bomb group, notoriously known as the Bloody 100th. They earned that name because of the catastrophic, disproportionate casualties they suffered on specific missions. Imagine being a replacement crew, showing up to the Bloody 100th, seeing empty bunks everywhere, and realizing the men who slept there yesterday are all dead.
Yet they climbed back into those freezing plains day after day. Reviewer Lieutenant General Bernard E. Traynor noted that the incredible cost detailed in this book sucks the wind out of the reader. He said, "It left me shaken. The bravery required to consciously walk toward that kind of danger repeatedly is staggering."
Eventually, the sheer weight of American industrial production began to turn the tide. The factories back home were pumping out bombers faster than the Germans could shoot them down. And crucially, the Americans finally developed long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks that allowed them to fly all the way to Berlin and protect the bombers.
The strategy, though unimaginably costly in human life, finally worked. They systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe in the air. By the spring of 1944, a German document quoted in the book admits, "We were masters in the air. The bitterness of the struggle had thrown a greater strain on the Luftwaffe than it was able to bear." The Allies achieved total air supremacy.
They won the sky. The invasion of Europe could proceed. But for tens of thousands of American airmen, the war did not end when their planes went down in flames over Germany. If they managed to parachute out and survive the descent, they were captured. For them, the war just moved to the ground.
Which brings us to the climax of the book's human narrative, and one of the most harrowing and profoundly ironic chapters of the entire war, the winter of 1945 and the Blizzard March.
Let's set the stage for this. It is late January 1945. The 1,000-year Reich is collapsing. The Russian army is rapidly advancing from the east like a tidal wave, closing in on cities like Posen and Breslau. They are pushing right toward the massive German prisoner of war camps, specifically Stalag Luft III, located near Sagen.
To understand the scale of what is about to happen, we have to look at the numbers. Among the hundreds of thousands of Allied prisoners held by the Germans, there were 95,000 Americans. And of those, 38,000 were airmen, the bomber crews and fighter pilots who had been shot down over the years.
With the Russians just 80 miles away, Hitler issues an order. He commands the Luftwaffe to evacuate these prisoners to move Stalag Luft III and other camps further west, away from the advancing Red Army.
But Hitler's reasoning was incredibly twisted. He wasn't evacuating them out of adherence to the Geneva Convention or to save their lives. He wanted to keep these 38,000 airmen as hostages. As his empire crumbled, he thought they were valuable bargaining chips.
He actually wanted to use them as human shields, didn't he?
Yes, he considered billeting them, housing them, in the specific town centers that the Anglo-American air forces had heavily bombed, essentially using them as human shields to stop further attacks. Another contingency plan was simply to execute them all in mass reprisals if the bombing campaign didn't stop.
Faced with this collapsing, chaotic command structure, the camp guards began the forced evacuations. This became known as the Blizzard March. And this was not an orderly logistical transfer. These were brutal, forced marches on foot and in freezing, overcrowded boxcars through the absolute chaos of a dying nation in the dead of one of the worst winters on record.
For 3 months, these men were effectively lost to the world outside their confinement. The logistical chains of the German army had completely broken down. The text notes that even the International Red Cross was entirely unable to track them. They became ghosts wandering through a collapsing society, starving, freezing, suffering from dysentery, and dying on the side of the road.
And this is where Miller draws out this profound, almost sickening psychological irony. Think about the entire experience of these airmen up to this point. They had spent their entire war 5 miles above the earth. They had only ever seen the conflict from 25,000 feet.
Right, through a bomb site.
Through the lens of a Norden bomb site, the war was clinical. The targets were just grid coordinates on a map. an industrial zone. You push a button, the bombs fall, you turn around, and you go home to England. They were completely disconnected from the physical reality of the destruction they were causing.
But now, forced to march on the ground, trudging through the snow and the mud, that clinical distance was gone. They were literally walking through the massive civilian devastation they had caused with their own bombs. They were smelling the burning rubble. They were seeing the shattered cities, the homeless, starving families, the collateral damage of daylight precision bombing.
The psychological dissonance must have been overwhelming. They are witnessing firsthand the devastation they wrought, while simultaneously experiencing the sheer barbarism of the Nazi regime they had risked their lives to destroy. They are facing the brutality of their guards, the desperation of the German populace, and the sheer chaos of a defeated, crumbling nation.
Gail Clevin, a legendary commander from the Bloody Hundredth, captured the surreal horror of this experience perfectly. He later said, "What many of us saw and experienced, no one at home would have believed." The sterile academic theory of air power born on the chalkboards of Maxwell Field had finally collided with the gruesome, tactile reality of the ground. The disconnect had completely vanished.
Miller highlights some incredible specific stories from this period of the collapse. He talks about Rosie Rosenthal, one of the most famous pilots from the Bloody Hundredth. Rosenthal had actually been shot down and wounded on a brutal raid over Berlin in February 1945. He managed to evade capture, got back to Allied lines, and recovered.
He rejoined his unit, the 100th, but as he put it, he was too late to get another crack at the Germans. The combat phase of the air war was effectively over.
But Rosenthal didn't just go home. He volunteered for what the Air Force called revival missions. These were mercy runs. The 8th Air Force's final mission in Europe wasn't dropping high explosives. It was stripping the bombers of their guns, filling the bomb bays with food and supplies, and bringing liberated Allied prisoners of war out of the squalor of southern Germany and Austria, back to transit camps in northern France where they could finally be treated.
He was trying to find his own men.
Yes. Rosenthal flew a mission to Linz, Austria to pick up liberated French POWs. He desperately wanted to fly down to southern Germany to pick up the very American airmen he had flown alongside.
For those airmen who survived the death marches in the camps, the moment of liberation was deeply traumatic and surreal. The text provides a powerful first-hand account from Lieutenant Lew Laevsky. He was waiting to be picked up at Moosburg, which was an enormous, overflowing prison camp near Munich that was finally liberated by General George Patton's army.
Laevsky's words are just devastating. He described the arrival of the Americans. He said, "It was like a bolt from the blue. One day we were slaves, the next day we were free. On the day we were liberated, a lot of the men broke down and cried. I didn't. I willed myself not to cry. I thought I was dreaming and that if I cried, I would wake up and still be a prisoner."
That quote encapsulates the psychological toll. If we synthesize what this march, the camps, and the liberation meant for the legacy of these airmen, it confirms that no man emerged from this experience unburdened. The text explicitly states, no airman on the march outlived the burden of his experience. They survived, but they carried the trauma of the freezing skies and the trauma of the burning ashes with them for the rest of their lives.
Which brings us to the end of our journey through this monumental history. The arc we've covered today is immense.
It really is. We began with the renegade vision of Billy Mitchell, a man who looked at the static, muddy slaughter of World War I trench warfare and prophesied a war fought entirely from the clean blue sky to shorten human suffering.
And then we followed his fiercely loyal disciples, the bomber mafia, as they pushed the physical limits of human endurance and primitive aviation technology, turning wild public stunts into the vital research and development needed to cross oceans and weather systems.
We moved into the academic halls of the Air Corps Tactical School, where the uniquely American doctrine of daylight precision bombing was born, a theory that relied on identifying industrial choke points with mechanical computers, completely ignoring the reality of the defenses they would face.
We confronted the terrifying, visceral reality of putting that theory into practice. We saw young men trapped in unpressurized aluminum tubes, fighting a desperate, freezing mano-a-mano battle against flak and fighters, resulting in staggering heroism and deep psychiatric ruin.
And finally, we followed those who were shot from the sky into the bitter cold of the Blizzard March. We watched the masters of the air forced to walk through the very ruins they had created from above, confronting the absolute, unavoidable human cost of their campaign on the ground.
It is a phenomenal, sweeping arc, and it reminds us of the true value of reading a book like Donald L. Miller's Masters of the Air. This is not just a book about airplanes or military tactics. It is a profound, deeply researched study of human fragility. It shows us exactly what happens when abstract theories of war, born on sterile chalkboards and driven by new technology, inevitably collide with fragile human lives.
It forces us to look past the machinery, past the strategy, and past the sanitized history to see the individual 19-year-old kids who had to bear the terrifying weight of those decisions in the sky.
And that leaves me with a final, lingering thought for you to mull over as we wrap up. We started this journey looking at how Billy Mitchell used new technology, the airplane, to try and distance the attacker from the muddy horrors of the trenches. He wanted to make war more precise, more strategic, and faster. Today, we are continuing that exact same pursuit. We invent drones, artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, all designed to make conflict even more clinical, more precise, and more distant. We want to fight wars from a screen thousands of miles away. But looking at what happened to the bomber boys on the Blizzard March, we have to ask ourselves, does all this technology actually reduce the horror of war? Or do we just delay the inevitable moment when the creators of that conflict are eventually forced to walk through the rubble, face the survivors, and reckon with the human cost face to face? Think about that. We will catch you on the next Deep Dive.